The Spectator magazine is home to wonderful writing, insightful analysis, and unrivaled books and arts reviews. Subscribe today for just £12 and receive a 12-week subscription in print and online. Alongside that, you get a £20 John Lewis or Waitrose voucher. Go to spectator.co.uk/voucher.
Hello and welcome to the Americano podcast, a series of discussions about American politics, power and prejudices. This year, 2024, is an election year in America, a presidential election year. And so we will be doing 2 podcasts a week rather than our usual one, because we want to and because we know you can't get enough Americano in your life. I am delighted to be joined by Nellie Bowles, who is author of a new book which is called Morning After the Revolution, Dispatches from the Wrong Side of History. And it is a book about a very strange thing that happened in American life, which is the year 2020, the extraordinary convulsions we saw in American society. And I've read quite a lot about this subject, but I've never read anything that is as funny about what happened that year. And so I'm very grateful to Nellie for writing this, because it was a very weird moment in our lives, I think. And only you, I would say, and I'm not just being a flatter, have brought to light how funny it was. Because for a start, Nellie, tell us about 2020, your experience of it, working for the New York Times. What happened to you? How you started reporting on this strange phenomenon.
Thank you so much. And I do find the last few years pretty funny. And the thing is, everyone is right now really on both sides of the political aisle, very serious about everything that's going on. I mean, the left certainly is famously not funny about anything anymore, and everything is deadly serious. But the right too is everything's the end of the world. Every college protest is the fall of the university. Yeah, so the book is about sort of how we got into this madness that we're all seeing so clearly now, and what happened over the last few years. And it starts with me as a young reporter at the New York Times trying to cover some of the revolution and finding that that's really hard and that I'm getting a lot of pushback. And so the book is basically, that's the first few pages to set it up, and then the book is basically me leaving the paper and going out and reporting on the revolution over the last few years, and going to different scenes and trying to be on the ground in these different spaces and bring the color of the moment and the reality of the moment and the complexity of the moment. So different scenes like Antifa protests in Seattle and Portland, or George Floyd Square, or the, a homeless encampment village, which if you live on the West Coast, these kind of spring up all along the American West. And to try to cover this in a way that is a little bit light, a little bit tight, and that doesn't try to caricature any of the movement, or tries as best as I can to not caricature this, and to see kind of the new progressive from their own side as well. Because I start the book as kind of part of the revolution and as a member of the New Progressives, and thinking this could only lead to good places. I try not to come at it and just say this is dumb and this is silly.
I think what I like particularly about the book is it's very easy to mock, the woke and so on. And I work for a magazine that's generally considered conservative. I suppose I'm a conservative in many ways. And it's fair game to mock the woke. What I find fascinating about your book, and particularly the chapters where you get in with them, you actually go along to see them, see what they hear. You do find them funny, that's clear, but you don't object to them because you see yourself as a progressive. You're not a conservative, are you?
I wouldn't really identify as one thing or another right now. I would say my politics are extraordinarily incohesive and influenceable by, if I see an RFK ad and I'm like, am I an RFK voter now? I would say I'm an American swing voter right now.
But you like progressives, I think. You're not as so. When you describe the Antifa people in the Chaz or whatever it's called. For listeners that don't know, we're talking about what was it called? The Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone.
Yeah, this was so in Seattle, a group of anti-fascist protesters who are the sort who believe that armed violence, armed resistance is appropriate. And at the time, that was considered really radical to have this group rising. Now, with this sort of embrace of Hamas tactics, we see that as more mainstream. But a group of armed Antifa guys mostly, or gender ambiguous folks, took over a neighborhood in Seattle, like literally took it over, declared these few blocks to be Antifa zone. There were no police allowed in. There were no ambulances allowed in. And the city of Seattle, oddly, embraced the whole thing. The city of Seattle, the mayor said it was like the summer of love. She called it like a carnival, like a festival-like atmosphere. The city then helps pay for some of the blockades for this new district, I guess, or whatever you want to call it. And within that, you see the early attempt at a full sort of progressive utopian vision. And so I went into there to see it and to spend time and to try to get some sense of the reality there, because all the coverage at the time when they set up that space, of course, you see the conservative news with headlines about Seattle falling, headlines about this, and then you see the left-wing news like NPR doing things like profiles of the beautiful movie nights and the community garden, and it all seemed a little bit fake. So I went up there to spend some time in that zone.
But did you find the Fox News interpretation of it, although obviously biased, to be more real than the kind of CNN, MSNBC version of what was going on?
I thought both were kind of true in a way. I mean, I think that the Fox News angle misses the Fox News angle of, let's say, because I don't want to pretend to know everything they wrote about the place, but let's say at its most extreme of like Seattle falling, woke mobs taking over. I think there's truth in that, in the same way that there's truth in the NPR and left-wing media coverage that says that there's beauty in the community gardens and all of that. I think just neither are entirely reality. And that a lot of these efforts that we saw over the last few years do have like beautiful impulses and come from people who are genuinely trying to make the world a better place. And the outcomes tend to, in a lot of these social movements we've seen in the last couple of years, the outcomes tend to be misguided. But I don't think it's like evil intent, or I don't think they're trying to destroy Seattle. I think they tried to really make a utopia. And that to miss the sort of beauty of the movement and the movement's own efforts to not take those seriously is to kind of miss part of why the last 4 years happened, or 5 years happened. Like, there's a reason BLM struck a nerve. There's a reason these movements struck a nerve, and there's a reason that they won. To ignore why these movements have won is to not be able to really argue with them, I find. And like now, the revolution is sort of over in a sense, in a way that it's not as loud, except now, of course, what's happening on college campuses is quite loud, but like you're not seeing the huge marches in the street of BLM of 2020 and 2021. But the revolution has won, certainly. I mean, the DEI statement you have to write in order to get a job at any American institution, that's the revolution winning. Or the fact that medical students in LA were required to get on their hands and knees and pray to the earth goddess and pray against white science, which is medical school, I guess. Like, that's the revolution winning. So there's clearly something that very, very much appeals here. And there's clearly a flaw that they're accurately pointing out. Now, the Seattle Autonomous Zone was an absolute disaster in the end. So in the end, you could say that Fox News was more right if you're trying to like pick one, because it was a total disaster. People died. A kid was murdered in the zone. And yet I think if you just see it like that, I think you miss some of why those politics are now taking over the broader American democratic politics. The embrace with the current moment right now, the full embrace of violent tactics and the sort of chance of by any means necessary. That's a classic Antifa style belief system.
Well, and like the looting stuff, I guess, too. But I suppose what I found absolutely thrilling and fascinating about your book is that you touch on something that a lot of conservatives don't get, which is that these people don't care about logic. And the more you present logic to them, the more they're rejected. So there's this great...
What are you thinking of?
I think about Tima Ukun. Absolutely extraordinary chapter. It's called The Most Important White Woman in the World. And Tima Okun came up with these things that are white, like objectivity is one of them, right?
Yes.
And so the more you rebel as a white person, or even as a non-white person, the more you rebel against these ideas of sort of truth or objectivity or things that make sense to intelligent minds, the more you're proving your whiteness, and you have to be dismissed, right? Am I wrong about that?
No, you're completely right. So this is one of the stranger things that's happened in the last few years. And I don't know if this list made it outside of America so much, but it definitely impacted America. And it was a list put out by a white woman anti-racist educator who came up with the idea that there are a set of white supremacy characteristics. And these characteristics are white values and white traits that white people impose on the world and demand of other people to adhere to and to value. But they're white traits, and to demand other people adhere to them and value them is to assert sort of white dominance or colonialism or social colonialism kind of, or racism. And what she defines these traits as, and before I even say them, this list was embraced by mainstream liberal America. It was so embraced and so proudly embraced that the Smithsonian Museum made a poster, a beautiful sort of graphic poster of the traits as part of the Smithsonian work. The list includes white traits such as white in quotes, such as individualism, the right to comfort, worship of the written word, objectivity, timeliness. Now, I find it hard to talk about this chapter in some respects because to me, listing that and describing those as white traits is so racist. It's so shockingly racist. It's like crazy that I'm saying it, but yes. So this is part of what informed and undergirded the modern American anti-racist movement. So you see that in the pushback against, let's say, standardized tests in the SAT or against accelerated math classes, because the idea is timeliness. Let's say a timed standardized test. That's a white value. That's whiteness at work. And you see it in, let's say, the push for objectivity, like you were saying, like, let's talk about facts. Let's talk about what the actual reality is. Like, let's have a newspaper that's objective, or let's have a this or that's objective. If that's a white trait, then you're imposing your racism on the situation, because objectivity is not universally shared or understood. Is the idea there?
What I love particularly is the end of the chapter where Tima says there's going to be another set of values that she's going to announce, and then she says no, they're going to be late because urgency is white supremacy. So she doesn't even announce her own new values at some meeting that 1,000 people have come to. I find that absolutely extraordinary. It must have been mind-blowing for you to watch this.
Yeah, I mean, it's more mind-blowing that this list and these ideas took over so effectively and won the day. It makes you sit back a little and say, sort of, what went wrong that this could be the winning idea for years, and that so many really smart people in America's greatest institutions could get behind the idea that objectivity and the written word and timeliness and urgency were white. This is crazy. And I think one of the reasons that I try to trace in that chapter is that earlier iterations of anti-racist activism were very much focused on like tangible changes, getting laws changed, doing campaigns to make the world better for people in other countries with horrible governments. And it was about galvanizing sort of upper middle class white ladies in America often to care about people outside themselves and to get active and to do the hard work of making like change in a democracy. Then what Tema and the list and this broader movement, it wasn't just her, but she was a major figure in it. What this broader movement said is actually, you don't need to do all that external work. That actually the work of anti-racism can be internal and psychological. And it's about you sitting with yourself and getting over your perfectionism. That's, of course, one of the white values, perfectionism. It's about you sitting with yourself and letting go of your sense of urgency. You're always rushing. That's whiteness at work. And it turns out that's really appealing. And that's a very appealing thing for a lot of, especially white women, but white people in general. It's very nice for anyone to sit down and say, I actually don't need to do a lot of external work. I don't need to learn about all these silly laws and all these other places. And actually, I can just do what amounts to therapy with myself, to improve myself, to be less of a white force in this world. And so it won the day. That model, the therapeutic model of anti-racism. And so that's what we saw for the last 4 or 5 years. Nothing was focused on like tangible change and actually talking about focusing on tangible change or talking about moderate technocratic increases. It was considered and is still considered by many to be racist. Like the full answer had to be just abolish your inner whiteness, abolish the police. Don't talk about minutia, laws, and all of these silly things that need paperwork and deadlines and committees. That's silly. So the therapeutic model of anti-racism became the winning theory of the day. And then I've got another chapter that goes to like a Robin DiAngelo, a training course that
this is my other favorite chapter. But yeah, sorry, carry on, Nellie.
So basically, once you have the list, you have the idea that we have to excavate these traits out of us as white people, as white women, especially, and that will save people of color. And then the next chapter I do is one of the, there's many of these anti-racist training courses that crop up, these classes that are basically group therapy, where white people work on excavating their whiteness. And again, none of it is about external change, making things better for a person of color in the world somewhere, making them richer or any of those things. And that's considered, even me talking about that or wanting that is sort of imposing my values and my whiteness on people of color. So it's considered really inappropriate to talk like that. It all has to be internal. And so I went to like a 4-day long sort of internal excavation, and it was very moving. It was very impactful. I cried. Like I was definitely changed by it in a way. And the over the course of the week, you have to confess a lot of your internal whiteness. And what that looks like is just sort of a confessional for ancestral flaws, for the times you've asserted urgency and objectivity into situations. I mean, it's a long confessional, and that confessionals actually feel really good. And especially if you're we were a bunch of upper middle class white ladies sitting around apologizing.
That's exactly what a lot of it is it not, Nellie? That it's assuaging the guilt of privilege. Everybody who's privileged feels guilty because they're privileged. And a lot of what you're describing are women, sometimes men, who are trying to deal with the fact that they can't cope with their own privilege.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think that there's just a human impulse that wants to make the world better. And I think that a lot of these folks come into it wanting to do that. And now that impulse is being directed in ways that I would say are kind of not the most useful. And we're being told that actually doing useful stuff is antithetical to anti-racist work. So let's say you want to, I mean, there's a line a lot of the anti-racist teachers say, and they'd say it in various slightly different ways, but basically, like, you're not trying to expand the boardroom table, i.e., you're not trying to get corporate America to be more diverse. You're trying to dismantle corporate America. You're trying to dismantle the table. You don't want the table there. We don't need the boardroom. That's kind of like the attitude. So it's the attitude of like, you're not trying to make it so that a Black kid born in a poor neighborhood has as good a shot of getting a good score on the SAT as a white kid born in a wealthy suburb. You're not trying to make that happen. What you're trying to do is get rid of the SAT, get rid of the test, get rid of the measure. It's not about making the little tangible changes in that person's life. But does this come from guilt of privilege? I think that guilt of privilege could be used in a lot of productive ways, because I think privileged Americans are privileged Americans and they can do a lot of good for the world. I think that basically this movement that has won the day is just an unproductive use of that sometimes useful sense of guilt, or maybe in England you'd call it like a noblesse oblige, a sense of obligation to your fellow countrymen that is good and that shouldn't be like made fun of or wiped out.
Well, that's what I'm really fascinated, Nellie, is like the sense in which America's scrambling around for a class system, because we're washed up. We've used up our class system. We don't know what it's for anymore. But America, for a long time, hasn't really had one, and I wonder whether a lot of this is privilege. A lot of what you're talking about is privilege trying to express itself in a world that doesn't believe in privilege, that doesn't believe in class. And so you end up with all this crazy stuff that you're talking about.
We just need to bring back the class system that England.
That's where I was going. That's where I was very unsubtly going at that point.
We just need a few lords and viscounts and
exactly. Well, maybe. I mean, maybe too. I'm not saying that is the ideal system, but I think what's going on is you're scrambling around. Also, the other thing, before I get onto my boring class points, Nellie, I want to talk to you about COVID, because this is a clear theme of the book, is that you're dealing with an America that's just shut itself down, a country that's obsessed with freedom, that has just sort of blown it for a large part of its population. And that, to me, when I looked at the George Floyd riots and so on, I thought, that's what's going on. It's people have been locked up for ages and they go crazy because we're social creatures. Do you think that what you're talking about was metastasized in some way by COVID and by George Floyd and so on?
Yes and no. I think that the movement embraced the COVID lockdowns as a tool of the movement. I don't think the COVID lockdowns necessarily created it. I think the movement helped extend and deepen the lockdowns. It was a very useful tool because what it allowed was for many protests to be banned and many activities to be banned, but these protests were allowed. So you had like doctors saying that people shouldn't ever leave the house and shouldn't ever do this and that, and preschools were shut down and churches were shut down. And yet you had marches like White Coats for Black Lives, where you had doctors in their white coats taking to the streets in what was, we were told, the height of the most important parts of lockdown. But for Black lives, it was worth it. For this movement, it was worth it. It was okay. And so I actually think COVID was a really important tool for the movement to use. Obviously, COVID was also real. Like, I was scared of getting it. I was thrilled to be vaccinated. And after I was vaccinated, I was pretty much done with my lockdowns. But the movement wanted to extend that because what lockdowns meant was a sort of societal, social control that was extraordinarily useful. Shutting down social spaces that much of the country used could help fray those connections. And some of those connections were ones that the movement didn't want happening. So I don't think it's a coincidence that progressives were the ones who wanted to keep lockdown going indefinitely. And if they had their druthers, many would still have us in lockdown.
But what do you think the movement, as you call it, wanted to do? What do they want to do? Do they want to destroy?
I think they saw it as a tool of a major American revolution, of like a social revolution in the country, which it kind of was. And I think it was used pretty effectively. Like, you never read about a BLM protest being a super spreader event. You never read about, but you saw 5 guys get together to go to the beach, and that would be reported on as like the most evil thing that ever happened. And so I think they wanted to use it to advance a social agenda and make radical, huge societal change, which pretty effectively happened. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't like, I was before the vaccine was out. I think locking down made sense for a little while. I think once we knew that kids were safe, they should have gone back to school. Like, I'm pretty like moderate on all the COVID stuff. I'm like thrilled with the vaccine and whatnot. But I do think the lockdown forever community had obviously a political agenda beyond just COVID and paranoia. Now, maybe they're just paranoid about COVID truly, but I don't think so. And maybe they genuinely think that if you're at a BLM protest, you're not going to catch it. But I don't think they're that naive. I think they're really smart.
But what do you think about the way the media covered? So you worked at the New York Times. When did you leave the New York Times? That was mid 2021, am I?
2021, yeah.
So, you were working at the New York Times, and you, in the introduction to your book, you explained that, people started to become uncomfortable with you, not because you weren't on board with what they were saying, but just that they thought there might be something slightly suspicious about your interest in stories. And that's what ultimately pushed you out of the New York Times, right?
Yeah. I mean, it started with discomfort with jokes, which is basically like, if you tried to make anything about this funny, you were automatically seen as suspect. But no, I was at the Times and basically wanted to report on the most interesting stories that were happening in 2020, which had been my job for a few years. I'd been a floating features reporter, reporting on a ton of different stuff. I started as a tech reporter, then was kind of floating around doing different features, and it was really fun. And in 2020, I was like, okay, these are amazing stories. I wanted to go up to Seattle because a bunch of the local businesses were suing the city for not protecting them, i.e., they're paying taxes, but they're not getting police in return, et cetera. And I ended up just getting a ton of pushback internally from largely colleagues. The bosses, I mean, my boss at the Times was actually wonderful, one of my best bosses, and she tried to protect me from what was going on, but it was impossible at a certain point. But yeah, I mean, basically within every American newsroom, you had a very sudden tightening of what was allowed to be reported on. You had a very sudden narrowing of what could be a journalist's field of vision. And you saw it often quite explicitly. So NPR came out and explicitly said, we are not covering Hunter Biden's laptop. That was just a rule they announced. We're just not. And they said it's a non-story, which is what someone always says whenever they don't want you to do a story on whatever their scandal is. They'll come and they'll say, Nellie, this is a non-story. It's a non-story. And I'm like, okay, it sounds kind of like a story. But yeah, so I was pushing back against that in like what I saw is relatively minor ways. But it was just completely incomprehensible to the staff of the paper and to the union. The union of the paper became kind of a cudgel of the new sort of morality police within.
But that's what I find fascinating about New York Times, NPR to a certain extent, all these sort of liberal American media, is that they are grounded in very deep ideas about truth. Even if they're like hopelessly liberal by my standards, whatever, they have, the New York Times for a long time had a very convincing way of doing reportage because it was grounded in truth. And yet what was very odd is that they rebelled against it, and you could see the New York Times rebelling against it. And whereas if that happened at a British newspaper, if there was some sort of takeover of the truth in the way that happened, in the way that you're describing, it would just happen very quietly. and everybody would just sort of agree that, like we weren't supposed to do stories about Black Lives Matter that were a bit problematic or whatever. It would just sort of happen. Whereas I think what I love about America is that there was this public debate.
It was very openly stated by these news organizations and by their staff. Now, listen, the Times, NPR, these are big places with a lot of reporters. The Times is the biggest newspaper in America. There's thousands of reporters, and probably 95% of them are amazing and are trying their best. But what happened was basically a small faction of ideologues using in part the silly sounding internal tools of like Slack, like an all company message board where they could kind of ream whoever they wanted that day in front of the entire company, all their bosses. And so you'd have some like third level sub editor for Wirecutter just going after the New York Times top political reporter of the day. And that reporter would have to sort of respond or like get involved. And it would be this thing that was happening in front of 3,000 people in the all company Slack. It was insane. Now, I think a lot of that has been cracked down on now. And I think there's a very clear and explicit attempt at a course correction. So the Times is like a tanker ship. It has like many, obviously different shifts and stories forward ahead. But in this particular moment, it was taken over by the wackiest faction you can imagine, and mostly by people who were sort of dissatisfied reporters or dissatisfied third-rate editors, like people who weren't that talented but who could do internal politics really well. And so this was a very fun way for them to kind of police all the top reporters at the paper, so to go after the top political reporters. You could see it almost as a career move in a way, and I think for a lot of them it was. But yeah, it was done very explicitly. I mean, it wasn't subtle, but made it relaxing in a way because I didn't have to guess at what was happening. It was like, no, we just don't cover negative stuff about what's happening. We don't believe that Antifa is part of the 2020 events. Like, that's just fake news.
Were you nervous about losing your job when you were reporting all these stories? Because you did all these amazing reports in 2020, 2021. Did you get nervous that you were going to be just out of the job, or were you not worried? Did you always think that there'd be an audience for what you were writing?
I was really nervous. At first, I thought I could stay at the paper because I was naive. I was kind of almost childish in my belief system in like the slogans of the paper. And then when I left and started reporting the chapters for this book, yeah, I was nervous. I was super nervous. I was scared. But at the same time, my wife and I were starting a little Substack. At the time, it was called Common Sense. It was a little newsletter that she really started, and I joined in once I saw that it was doing well. Like all good entrepreneurs, I just sort of jumped on something that I already could see was succeeding. And so I knew through this little Substack, this little newsletter that was starting to put out basically my wife's writing, and then after that I started writing for it. I could see there was interest in something that wasn't as agenda driven as what the Times was providing. And so I had a sense that it would be okay. And also, like, what are you going to do? Like, it was becoming it was just totally untenable to stay there at a certain point. And so I was just, I knew there had to be something else I could do with my time in my life than sit around and be bullied by these like crazy lunatics who don't want you writing, don't want you reporting, don't want you having a sense of humor. I mean, you can't live your life like that.
You seem to me to be obsessed with the absurdity of this kind of progressivism. And that doesn't mean that you dislike it. It doesn't mean that you're rejecting it in a conservative way. But you find how absurd it is amusing. And that comes across in your writing. You're like a kind of, I don't want to be pretentious, but you're like a Tom Wolfe. You're like a modern Tom Wolfe, aren't you?
I want to be like a dime store. If I could be like the shittiest version of him, that would be an honor.
Less of the new journalism flourishes, but that's your thing. You're finding absurd stuff in American life, and you're not exposing it. Is a silly thing to say, but you're just reporting on it.
It's really fun. There's a lot of space there. the pleasure right now is like, as the mainstream American press has relinquished any efforts or has just like ended any efforts at reporting on what was going on in the progressive movement or in the Democratic Party for the last few years. And again, the Democratic Party has been in power in America for the last 4 years. So it's like, it's a little weird to not report on the things that progressives are doing when this is the group in charge. But as that has been relinquished, there's just been a lot of open space. It's just been really fun. Like there's just a ton to write about that, and there's very little competition because everyone's so nervous. Bear and I joke about this. My wife and I joke about this idea of time laundering, which is that an idea has to spin around the independent media world and the conservative media world for approximately 2 years before the mainstream liberal press is allowed to cover it. So something like puberty blockers having side effects. The Substack press gets a full 2 years to cover that. And then the mainstream press is allowed to touch it. Like the crime wave, we're given just a couple years head start to write about that, and then the mainstream press is allowed to touch it. And so that's great. We've built a whole business on having that 2 year head start on every interesting sort of scoop and storyline. And so I'm just rooting for those Slack activists to keep at it, guys. Keep them in line, keep them slow, keep them scared.
Well, I think we'll end it there, Nellie. But thank you very much for coming on to the Americano podcast. I hope we'll have you on again because I do recommend this book very much. It's extremely funny. And as someone who's tried to understand what's happened in America for the last 8-10 years, quite a lot, I found it extremely useful. So thank you very much, Nellie Bowles.
This was such a pleasure to come on. Thank you so much.
That's all for this episode of the Americano podcast. I'd like to thank my brilliant producer, Natasha Feroz, and urge you to leave a generous, kind, and warm-hearted review of this podcast on whichever platform you listen to it.